Recording. So, welcome today with Ida, who will give us her insights on how to build independent and self-reliant communities, which is what we're all about here at the Pirate Academy, enabling people, empowering people to do that. I'm very curious to hear about Ida's life first. Who she is, and then about how she would build such a community and what her focus would be inside of that. And of course, we don't expect her to build the entire community, but an aspect of her. And I have a guess what that will be, but she can flesh that out as much as she wants. So thank you, Ida, for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting. As we talked about before, we met once before, that it's so important to have these high-level conversations. Yeah, I'm excited.
Cool. Then let's dive in by you sharing, who are you?
Yeah, who am I? That's another big picture question that's useful to handle every once in a while.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll take you through some of my interests and motivations that tie together some aspects of my life. So I would say one question that I've always wondered about and always explored is really what motivates people towards a certain behavior. Why do people act the way they do? And for me, that really started from when I was super young, maybe 6 or 7, with theater and music and film. I tried to gather all of my friends, little kids, into these theater plays that were actually pretty dark. It was usually about death and what's the point of life. I was a mini philosopher even as a kid.
Crazy.
And trying to explore that through art. So I got pretty deep into filmmaking and specifically film directing, where the point is to understand why do people behave a certain way, because that's how the story unfolds. And from there, I really got interested in more of the academic approach. So I actually ended up doing an interdisciplinary degree where my focus was on anthropology. And that's culture. So people in groups, what motivates entire societies towards a certain action. That really changed my whole way of thinking strategically, not just as individuals, but as a group. Like, what's going on here? And from there, I entered the business world. So I went into tech and the startup world because that's such a driver of change and such a driver of motivation in society, at least in Western society right now, for what's going on. That was the next step. And now I'm setting up my own agency to try and basically drive the business world toward more social and environmental responsibility. And I do that with various forms of communication, whether it's marketing and storytelling or community building or whatever it might be that gets us there. So this one question, even though I've moved across disciplines, moved across industries, the question of what motivates us has really been at the core of my life. And yeah, in terms of how I approach those questions, one thing that came up during the time that I was studying, so I studied in England at Cambridge, and I also did it interdisciplinary. So it wasn't just anthropology, it was actually also politics and sociology. And I figured out that kind of how we can approach human behavior or societies can exist on different levels when we think about them. So on the one hand, you have the individuals and the people themselves and their customs and their everyday. Then you have institutions, you have, you talk about statistics, that's a higher level. Then you have the philosophy, the ethics, what underpins it all. And what I love and why I also ended up with anthropology specifically is because it oscillates, it moves between the bottom part of really sitting with people, listening to people, understanding them in their everyday, but then moving it right up to philosophy and saying, what does this mean about humanity? What does this mean about being human? So I'm the same. Like, I can sit and have this conversation about what does it mean to be in a culture, but probably when I leave, I'm going to have a really fun conversation with a random person on the street because I'm interested in their world. So moving between these 2 points, that's how my brain works.
Okay.
It's a really exciting place to be. So it's complex. These are complex questions. And my approach is to design the best processes that I can and yeah, try and do what I can for this world.
And that's why you're here.
That's why I'm here. Exactly.
Because we expect nothing less from you than describe to us how to shape a new world, a different world, in which people organize themselves in small, independent, self-reliant communities. And then the question, of course, arises, building on your image. What is the concrete action of the individuals in that world? What is the infrastructure layer, the institutions and rules and regulations and governance processes, etc. And then what's the meta level on top of that? So my guess is that this is your angle into looking at a community. So not how to do farming or how to build houses, but more to build culture and governance. And so with that, I think it's a good starting point for you to dive into that. And if it helps you, you don't have to do that, but if it helps you, you can flesh out a little where the community is that you think about while you think about it, or is you can also do this in abstract terms. You can position it somewhere in the world, give it some color if you want, but we're also good in just having the as I said, abstract version of it. So your stage.
Yeah,
off you go.
one of the most complex questions anyone's asked me in the last year.
My pleasure. I'm not sorry.
No, I know. You shouldn't be. But one of the things that I find the most important when you're tackling something this complex is to really be strategic. So, you know, on the one hand, I can break down culture, which, by the way, we're going to have to define. I can break it down to different elements and how you can use those elements to create a certain effect. But that wouldn't really make sense unless we know what effect we want and what the project really is. So I would say one thing that's distinct about how I would approach this is to really start on the meta level and say, what is the goal that we're trying to achieve? Because one of the things I learned, not just being in an academic world, but also being in a business world and a market landscape and seeing how these different things interact, is to know that, for example, if there is an element of the goal of creating these communities that actually has to do with influencing the world at large. So it's not just a thought experiment. It's not just saying, oh, if the rest of the world didn't exist, how would we start? It's saying that we want to start a community in a world that does exist, and we want this community to have an impact on the rest of the world. That's a different goal. And if you have that goal, not just within the community, but how you want to influence, then that can actually impact where you place the community. Because what's the most compelling story you can build in contrast to the people that you want to affect?
But for the sake of this conversation, I'd really like to focus on the internal workings of community.
Right.
So we're not trying to educate or convince anybody. So we're somewhere in the outback of whichever country you prefer. Pretty detached from civilization. There are some people working on building houses. There are some people working on providing food and all of these things. And now you're in charge of building the culture, the governance model of this independent community. Maybe once we've done that, we can go into how does that connect to the outer world, which is totally super important. But I think to reduce complexity a little bit, let's focus on this one thing first. So we have something between 100 and 1,000 people in this place. People are building stuff. How do we ensure that there's good culture, good governance, good all of that?
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's do that. In that case, I'm going to keep it in the abstract.
Okay.
So let's treat it as a thought experiment. If you have a closed culture, where do you really start? And I mean, it is useful to define it. I'm pretty sure we're all on the same page, but culture is a shared sense of or a shared set of assumptions, beliefs, and behaviors. So it's basically the reason we don't sit on the floor when we eat, or why we don't see a scrawny paper bill, but we actually see 20 euros or 10 cheeseburgers at McDonald's. So these are the ideas, the stories, the narratives, but also then the behaviors that govern how we act together. So it's useful that you say, well, we have people building houses, because that's a very practical example of people needing a shared idea of what's going on here in order to really collaborate on something together. So within that, there's kind of, you have culture with a big C and culture with a small c. So the big C culture is what we just kind of touched on, which is the meta narrative of what's the point of it all. But then you have the small c culture, which is the actual thing itself. And I can say from my experience, both from studying this, but also actually from driving culture change in certain places, that there are some elements that you can break it down into, and you can mix and match those and be deliberate about those to create the kind of culture that you want. So if I were to start this from scratch myself, I still would begin with questioning, what do we want this culture to achieve? Because if we say we want a successful culture, then we first have to say what's culture, and then we have to say what's success. So the first step would be, which goals are we actually trying to achieve here? Because all of the elements that we put in and the way we design those and engineer those, it has to be defined by where we want to go. And that leads me really to the first element of small c culture, which is ambassadors, or you might call it leaders. There needs to be some kind of source to where the community is going, some kind of direction, some kind of, I call it a lighthouse. So for example, I at the moment am running a virtual community. And when it's that small, to keep people engaged, they need to know who they go to in an element of crisis, or who they go to with questions. Who's the source? Who's the lighthouse? In a smaller community, that's super important to have. And it doesn't need to be just one person, but this group or this person is basically the one who, even if they don't decide everything, hosts the kind of vision for the community at large. The second thing would be, you need some good narratives. So the story of why we're here. Why did we break apart from the wider society? What do we think is going to be different here? And why is that meaningful to us? We need some shared story. And this is something that, if we do say that it's not fully isolated, but it's still a community in the world, that before you become a part of the community, this is a narrative that you already have to share and be aware of. So it's probably something that the people who build the community, people that would like me, we understand the narrative of why this was built, and we make sure that anyone who joins shares it and knows it. The third thing that's really interesting to play with is symbols. So something that joins people together is having a common sense of identity, not just in terms of a story or a literal belonging in the same area, but also a symbolic belonging to each other. And it's actually pretty crazy how powerful this can be. So one of the most traditional things would be a flag, or a sign, or something that tells us we belong together, something that we created that symbolizes our unity. So for example, when I was working on a culture change project for my college at Cambridge, it's one of those like really traditional places overall, and every college has this crest with the symbols of that particular history of that college. And yeah, so we ended up using that quite a bit, and we put it in way more places and aligned people around it. We gave people, sweatshirts with this way more than they ever had before, because it's a way to wear unity, or to see unity and be reminded of it. And actually, it's some pretty interesting research as well on how, for example, in the US, where the flag hangs pretty much everywhere outside houses, and it's just everywhere, that's something you can mobilize when you need more, for example, if you want a more nationalistic sentiment, you can point to that as a piece of unity that mobilizes people toward action. So symbols are super important. And this one is no shocker to anyone who's done any kind of anthropology, but you need rituals. So that's basically a heightened set of behaviors that again reaffirms what this community believes. And within that also is a very important point that it's consistent usually. So it comes at a consistent time, it operates in a consistent way, it's predictable, and its purpose is to really reaffirm the narrative, the point of why we're here, the values of this community. And that's also something that you can very much design. The funny thing about rituals is when you're in one, whether it's, you know, Christmas or whatever it might be, or actually it's a pretty bad example, that's more like a tradition, but okay, actually, maybe when I was leaving university and we had a huge ritual where I need to walk up to someone who's dressed in like mink fur and they pull my finger and all of a sudden I'm like out of the academic system. It's very strange. But the thing about that is it feels eternal almost. It feels godlike. It's like, oh, but it's always been this way. And that was super interesting because when you design new ones, you can create a sense of eternity, like eternal commitment to what you have in this community that may not at all be eternal, but if you do it right, it feels indisputable. So that's a very powerful thing that binds people together. And yeah.
I have a question with regards to source symbol and ritual, because there's always a flip side to that. It's very, very easy to that what you just described turns into a cult. That's a cult leader with very strong symbols that tie people into this cult, and then rituals that do the same. What do you have to do to balance this, to keep the openness, so this doesn't turn into a cult?
Okay, super important question. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I'm pretty sure anyone who listened would have had, at least if you're in any way postmodern, in the sense of not believing in one truth, for example, you would feel itchy listening to that. It's like, what? I don't want to be in an engineered culture where someone tells me what I should believe. That's really fair. And the point is not to manipulate, the point is to unify. So I think in terms of avoiding a cult-like approach, one of the most important things actually takes us more on the side of governance. And it has to do with building really important, strict processes for example, conflict arbitration, so that you don't just have one leader who's the source of good and bad, who's the arbiter of conflict, who basically gets to decide on everything, but instead you have a system of open conversation. You privilege maybe conversation, debate, rather than making the source responsible for that. And also, I think it's important not to underestimate that you do, in a situation like this, pick your own values. And it's very possible to pick diversity and friction as very important elements that you want to keep, because you actively do not want groupthink. And I think this is the first part of really deciding what are we about and what do we want to avoid. So even just having that explicit and designing processes that promote that is going to take you very far, because most cult leaders that have this ego-driven ambition to really be the core of someone's world, they wouldn't have as their genuine intention, let's create diversity and friction, because we want that, you know? So to me, it's about being incredibly deliberate about what culture you really want and what you value.
Okay, so you mentioned friction and diversity as possible values. What other values would you add, and or what are from your perspective, the non-negotiable values that should be part of that of a community?
For me, one huge component, because again, it's people to people, and you're not going to have a constructive people to people engagement unless you have a real sense of vulnerability and openness and compassion. So I would kind of group them in one. And that's really interesting, because one of the things I see leaders, for example, if we talk about corporate culture, company culture, there's a really strong sense that a CEO, for example, should have the answer to everything at all times. I've seen some rooms of very powerful people where no one knows and everyone tries instead of saying that they don't. So this openness and humility to be able to say, I don't know, does anyone else have an input here? Or I struggle with this, does anyone relate? To us who are more socially engaged in like our consciousness development, personal development, it might sound completely natural, but there are so many places still where this is not at all the norm. So vulnerable, open sharing, even if you're at the very top of an organization, I think that is something that also takes it very far. And cultivating this sense of openness and vulnerability will be crucial.
This, if I tie those two things together, you just said in a side note, essentially, that people who do a lot of work on themselves might have less trouble admitting that they don't know, which makes this work on yourself a necessary prerequisite for the culture you're trying to build, right?
Yeah, I would say so. And this is also very much a thought that's being developed pretty broadly right now. For example, Thomas Björkman, great mind, great person, writing about the need for consciousness development, more broadly for us to really recognize that it's not just about me as an individual in a market. It's really about trying to create constructive coexistence between people and nature. And the more you've worked past your ego self, which according to the developmental stages of psychology would be like a lower version of yourself, the more you work on yourself, the more able you are to recognize that the world is bigger than you. And this enables cooperation, humility towards nature, towards others. So yeah, personal development is a huge one.
So how would you institutionalize that? I mean, you somehow have to create a situation where you have a strong heterogenität. What's that in English?
Yeah.
In the group. So very diverse on the one hand, and they might be on various levels of the growth hierarchy of developmental psychology. So their interpretation of the values might also be different. Their engagement with the community is different. How do you integrate all of these different aspects and just these few into something that has a potential to be self-stabilizing, self-healing as a culture, in case you have like bad actors or involuntary bad actors, somebody who just isn't aligned and doesn't know how to express that properly.
Well, if you have compassion and empathy as a core value of your community, you'd be surprised how quickly you can de-escalate conflict. So I think one important thing will be for whoever arbitrates conflict to really remember that value and to see that, a compassionate conversation can bring almost anyone down to the calm level of actual negotiation around the needs in question. But in terms of organizing very different needs and different stages of development, I think this is actually a really good question, because so many times it's tempting to build rules for engagement. So like rules around how certain things are going to work or how certain practices are going to look. But actually you can also create processes where people are free to adapt to whatever needs they have within the same kind of process. So for example, if you were to institutionalize some form of reflection, let's say, you don't need to say everyone's going to journal for 1 hour on Friday. You can say there's space for reflection 1 hour on Friday. Someone's going to go off and meditate. Someone's going to journal. Someone's going to go into the woods, and Lord knows, but that's the purpose, and you can repurpose it for your own needs. I think that's so important, because it's so tempting to set rules when processes would actually be more effective.
But that's exactly the role of you as a cultural architect, to know this and understand that there is the need for a space of reflection, and the form of that reflection can take various forms over time or on a personal level. And if you think about that space for reflection, which I can totally relate to, what other processes would you love to implement in a community, and what their reasons be? So what happens if an entire community has this time for reflection once a week? You know, people used to have that with in the Western societies with mostly Christian faith. They used to go to church on weekends, and they would have that hour of reflection. So something of that kind is in probably almost any society that you look at. But what other things that we don't see because they're such an integral part of the way we live might require you as a cultural architect to implement processes around them?
One, I think, is really important is some form of mutual sharing. And this goes with the vulnerability thing. I do think, at least at the very beginning, when you're trying to instill any kind of culture, you need to lead by example, and someone needs to be the one to take the first punch, sort of, and creating some kind of forum for genuine, transparent, vulnerable openness that then, for example, can translate into learning. So it could be in the context of, I tried to build this house this week. I totally messed up the foundation in this way. Maybe next time we do it differently. Having a set way and space for people to share their vulnerabilities and their learnings to then improve those processes is super important. And I think that's something you have to engineer time for, because it's not the most, it's not the first topic most people usually go to, but it can be something that makes the difference for a community over time. Yeah, that one's super important. And well, again, like this comes down really to the goals of what the community is trying to achieve. Because if it was the case that we want to literally build our environment as fast as possible, then that's going to set up a certain kind of process and a certain kind of elements that you need to make sure that we align around that goal as well and as quickly as possible. But if the goal is something else, the processes will also be something else. So this one is a little bit tricky, but of course there are human things that we all need. I mean, I think this is something that really does benefit us, is to have undisturbed social time on a kind of regular basis without the element of work. So, you know, family Sunday dinners, I grew up with that. Some kind of connective, without any real agenda, but a space just for social connection on a regular basis, which could be anything. It could be the kind of campfire model, or just making sure that when you eat together, it's focused. And also I remember like one of the things that you asked me before this conversation was which part of the civilization that we're currently in I keep or not.
Oh, yeah, right.
And one of the really interesting things that is obviously super contested and has also brought many, many good things to the world, but this overemphasis on smartphones and social media and digital connectivity ahead of person-to-person connectivity, that one needs to be very consciously monitored, I believe, because it does break down the immediate connection in front of you in many cases. I mean, it's kind of intuitive. It's like, I remember once I went to go shopping with a friend and she had an earbud in and she was on her phone, and I tried to talk to her and I'm like, well, you're clearly in 3 places now at the same time. So creating space, again, that's a really good phrase, like creating space for interpersonal connection on a deeper level simply by eroding any distraction. That's going to be an important thing to build in, probably.
I can totally relate to these things. There are, however, some things also we have here in our current mode of civilization that is probably the most widely used thing, which touches on the sharing part. So we use this currency. You refer to it as the bill that translates into hamburgers or other things. And the way, essentially, this is a form of institutionalizing sharing. But if you look further back, it's very likely that before we used paper bills, we used something more like a gift economy. And I think while this element of giving each other stuff so we can all survive and thrive has both parts or equal parts of individual culture and nurturing of relationship, and at the same time a very cold economic survival element. How do you integrate those two?
Well, actually, one of the key questions that someone like Thomas is asking right now is, are we even in are we actually in a reality of scarcity anymore in this cold, hard survival mode? Is that even a precondition for our lives at the moment? Or is that just the system we've set up? Because in many ways, there is an abundance due to all the evolution we've had in technology and standard of living. So I would question some of the premises there to just say, like, what is actually the real condition of what we're doing here? And what's so interesting, first of all, anthropology, which I studied, is very known to be the thing that ruins Christmas. Because you go into it thinking, oh, okay, now I'm going to study gift economies, right? And that's so nice because people are exchanging real goods, it's person to person, sounds great. And you come out of it realizing, oh, there's no such thing as a free gift, actually. It's all based on ideas of reciprocity. A lot of the times these systems are very rationally built, and they bind people together, but so does money. So, you know, when you go out of touch with a person, I remember reading this in an article in the early days, that usually the most common thing that people definitely do if they don't want to have any contact with you anymore is settle your debts. Because that means the relationship is completely over. And the only reason we see money as inherently different to gifts is because we've relegated it to be completely separate. So for example, if I were to give someone money for their birthday, they'd probably feel that wasn't appropriate. But there's nothing that says that it needs to be that way. So I'm not personally, I don't fetishize gifts. I'm not fussed against money. I think the way we've structured it and the way we think about it as something completely separate is more of the problem. That the point is, what the gift economies want to do, regardless of the currency, whether it's money, gifts, whatever, is actually to bind people together and create a sense of interdependence. So I think you can create the function of interdependence with other means. And then in terms of survival for the society itself, it's probably a different question, if that makes sense.
I think maybe one way to look at the question of the problem of reciprocity in gifting might be the radius of your expectations. So, which means that if I have a very broad radius, very wide radius of expectations regarding gifting, it's more like what goes around comes around. Right? I can give something to one person and somehow mysteriously, magically get something back from the universe from a totally unrelated, unexpected direction. There is something similar in the Chinese culture, where these relations can go over several nodes and then come back to me. So if I help one person do something, then that social debt that occurs can be passed on, so that I could get a gift from somebody else, and there's a whole gifting mechanic going on inside of the of the social sphere.
But yes, and what's really, really interesting here, actually, so, we can't really talk about culture without talking about it from our own biases and our own point of view. And sometimes you can tell and sometimes not. And in this case, I wonder, because there's actually evidence that as humans, so if we go back to the very core of human nature, we are evolutionarily conditioned to want to help people. So this social giving is actually something that gives us a high. And I mean, anyone who's donated money and people say, oh, you're just doing it for yourself. Like, no, this is evolutionarily constructed that we want to help our fellow people because like over time, this was an evolutionary benefit. So I really believe that if you have the right conditions, this is how humans will behave. And we don't necessarily need to frame it within the frame of bartering or gift exchange or even market terms. And this is what I mean about the biases. We think that we need to institutionalize in a market mentality of things will come back and reciprocity, when actually that particular thing of giving back to your fellow woman or man or person is actually something that comes naturally to us if we are not in a sense of great scarcity. So I don't know that either needs to be in terms of economy, but more about creating the real sense of safety that would then allow people to act in accordance with what human nature would tell them to.
So in other words, you would have to come up with rituals and foundational values that help people build that trust and that sense of safety inside of their community. So they don't have to externalize this, or the way we ritualize it at the moment is by collecting money. That makes us feel safe because that allows us to get the things that we might otherwise not get. But if you don't need that because we can trust somehow that the community will help us, we will not need it. So how can we build that, the value set and the rituals around trusting that somehow the community will help us?
Well, here I think it's really useful to look at personal experience, honestly. Like the times you choose to trust something or someone or something in your existence usually relates to your experience. So like your lived experience, so you'd have to create a lived experience of something being on the line, but then being resolved. And so you can trust that it will be resolved. And I think, honestly, one thing we cannot leave here is the very material stuff. Like some of the reasons why I don't want to give all my money to charity is because I know I want food on the table. If I knew that that was always going to be the case, I wouldn't perhaps be so watchful in how much I give or relate to other persons. So creating a lived sense of material safety. Like if there was a sense in the community that we're going to run out of food any moment now, that's probably not the condition for people to really trust and give to each other, because on the first part, you need to take care of the biological, physical, material component of actually literally being safe. That would be the first condition. But then, yeah, it really comes down to, I mean, I can try and design a ritual like right now, but it would have to be this vulnerability component again of knowing that once you put something on the line, you are picked up. That's what builds trust. So if you share something vulnerable, but your community picks you up, you can trust that that will keep happening, and it increases the level of trust. Or if I'm hungry right now, but I got food, okay, great, good. I can increase my trust and my material access to what I need to survive. So like, yeah, institutionalizing risk and rescue in different ways.
Okay. So I get the sense that if we trust our intuition of what it means to be fundamentally human, as you pointed out, it's baked into our DNA essentially somehow, and that we support each other, because that will strengthen our odds for survival for ourselves from an evolutionary perspective. If we trust that, and we create an environment where the basic needs are met by the community for the community, then something can emerge, some culture can emerge that holds the space of trust even once everybody's feels safe and served for. Because one question that might come up is, once everybody feels safe, let's say generation 2, the farm's working well, everybody has a house, etc. You might, as a culture, you might lose the sense of what it means to build that, of that cohesive elements inside of the community. And I think that's where some more deliberate effort has come in to build that as an experience, as an rite of passage, like when you left university. That gives people the sense that this is not to be taken for granted. This is something they have to contribute to, but this is also something that holds them.
Yeah, great point. And I mean, we need look no further than the US right now to see people taking democracy for granted, for example. Not anymore, luckily, with a voter turnout, but you know, it's so easy to feel that what you have in terms of safety and belonging is perpetual, because that's kind of inherent in safety, that you move to the next level of concern. So yeah, I mean, let's think about what we would need right now, because that's probably what you would need there. I mean, I think paying greater attention to history is really important, and keeping history alive, because at the moment we've structured our political systems, especially on a very short-term basis. And obviously, if you have 4 years to change a country, you're not going to spend a significant amount of time talking about the history of that country, because it's really only about making this short-term prosperous or whatever it might be. So keeping history alive through keeping those narratives alive, and keeping, you know, people had murals. It could be anything. It's like making sure that what we've built, that the history of what we've built is still alive as an active story, rather than something just in the past.
Which could be encoded in art, right? I mean, storytelling, music.
Huge function or purpose of art is not just to, I mean, like for me personally, art has a lot to do with expanding my horizons and challenging my point of view and things like that, but it's also anchoring us really in our humanity and our history and the kind of direction of community and society. So yeah, art and history keeping, I think is a very good route to at least keep on the top of your mind that this is not something that has been there forever, because that is actually also, again, like a psychological human fallacy, that we do tend to think that where we are now doesn't relate so much to the past, or that where we are now is the greatest self will ever be, which is never true. But we somehow feel that way, that when we're so in the moment, basically, that we need to create more context around it. And that can be institutionalized.
Before we open it into where you originally started, the connection to the outer world, I'd like to go into the seed function, which is how do you negotiate the values? Because these are the underlying elements that are crucial, and that's, you refer to them coming from the source. But how do you negotiate that? How do you, is this something that comes from one person? Is this a group? Is this changeable? Is this, how does that work?
Yeah, awesome question. This is tricky, but this is where I think you need real leadership, actually. So it's very tempting in today's zeitgeist, although that is actually changing, but it's very tempting to say, and this may be also me being Swedish, but that consensus is really important. And that you need mutuality of agreement on the fundamentals of anything, really, including values for a community. But I really don't think that that's the way. If you want to build a small community, it's not going to encompass everyone, obviously, that's inherent in it. And you want people who care for the fundamentals of that particular community. They're free to pick anything else. So there would need to be, I don't think it should be one person, but a small group of people that have a genuine informed theory of human nature. For example, saying that we need to create trust because this creates the best in humans. You know, an informed understanding of how they see human relations and human beings, and creating the values based on our best guess, which is the best that anyone can do, for which values will get us there. And for example, when, so my anthropology thesis was about a Danish political party called The Alternative. They have 6 values and a logo and a name. And they said the things that cannot be changed in this organization are our 6 values, our logo, and our name. The rest, it's all good. We can change our processes, we change our policies. They do politics quite differently. They're not on the scale of left to right, where they say pick any policy that responds with their value at any moment in time. But what they will not change are those values. And I really think that's the way to go. We need bravery in that, to say, like, here's our theory of change. Here's our theory of humanity. These are the values we believe in. If you want to join, then you talk about the narrative of why the community exists. And if that fits, then join. If not, then not. Because otherwise, what do you have? You can't build a community against a revolving door of values that doesn't bind people. So yeah, I think it needs to come from the source.
Okay. So given that there are many sources of sets of values in the world, this community is not in isolation. And this is your original starting point today in that conversation. What are your thoughts on that? How do you integrate such an organization, such a community, in a world where other communities exist with entirely different value sets?
Yeah, this is again super complex. So yeah, let me try. But you know, one of the things that I think is really useful in that kind of setup is what we discussed about the history component. Because the need to reaffirm your history is more the case when you feel like there's no comparison anyway, and you're just completely within this one ecosystem. But if you're actually a sub-community in the world at large, you'll always have, unless I guess over many, many generations, but you'll probably have a conception that we are different from what's going on here. And the project that we're on is different from what's evolved in the world at large. And that can actually keep people way more connected to the history of the community and the mission in a really strong way that can solve that problem partly for you, I think. You know, one thing that I just thought of when you explained that just now is I'm not sure that a community like this would need to be for life or even permanent. Like, one of the things that I'm really seeing around me, at least, is that people want to find an escape and they tend to go and gather. For example, someone's buying some castle in France right now and is gathering lots of great thinkers to live there for a while. Let's see, and then maybe disintegrate, do something else, or people move in and out. That's obviously tricky because you want cohesion. But I do think that processes and narratives and the values can create cohesion, even if the same people don't necessarily come and stay forever. And that could be an interesting thing, because any independent community would have to consider their relationship to the outside world. And it's tempting to say, well, we want to build our own culture, so let's close it off. And that's where you may be approaching the sort of risks around the cult mentality. But there could be a way of seeing it as an integrated refuge or co-creation that is more fluid than something that's as bounded as that. That would be really interesting, because I haven't really seen that.
So to translate that into my language and thinking, to see if I understood that, if we assume there are many, many of these communities, and each of them is set up based on a different set of values, there might be a migration of people across those communities in search of a set of values that fits them here and now.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to change the set of values where they are, they move towards a set of values that it seems better for them.
Potentially, because I think the idea that we need to grow everything within our current community is like a remnant of the nation state way of thinking. And I'm not sure that it needs to continue that way.
But there's a potential for conflict in that, where you might feel that you want to live in a different set of values, but you want to do that with the people you love, and you love them because they've been there all your life. So it's hard for you to move away. So you'd be more inclined towards trying to change the values. And that then could create some conflict inside of that community, even if that community is embedded in a very open set of other communities with different sets of values, where you could find what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a crucial one. I mean, and it really, you're probably right. It does also depend, because we do have the conditions now for keeping your loved ones and your relationships going across borders way more than ever before. I mean, that might be naive of me as someone who's moved around a lot, and I've had long distance relationships to all of my friends and partners and family and everything. So for me, it's less top of mind, but yeah, I totally hear you. That could definitely be.
Even if we might not be able to take this technological layer for granted that we're using right now here. So if for some reason our electric grids break down, or then it's not so easy anymore, right? Then you have to sail across the planet to see people. So that might make things even more, even harder in that respect.
But then just to also remember that if that happens and we lose access to our technology as we know it, then our ability to inform ourselves about our alternatives for other community values will also go out the window. So to some extent, I mean, obviously information has traveled in the world without our form of technology, but I'd say that the likelihood that people are so compelled to move to a certain other community is also going to go down if our information technology is not at a level where we can keep ourselves informed about our alternatives, if that makes sense.
But there are some, I think, clever mechanisms already existent. So the Amish sent people away for a while, to essentially to make a conscious decision about whether they want to be part of the community or not, or where they want to be. There's something similar happening, or has been happening with carpenters, at least in Germany or parts of Europe, where once your education as a carpenter is finished, you start traveling until you find a place you settle at. And to this day, you find people walking the lands as carpenters to find where they will settle. So in other words, this could be a way to ensure mimetic and genetic diversification, and also the information flow towards or around a larger set of communities where regarding the value set. So you know roughly, okay, I have to go east if I want to find that one community that represents the values I'm looking for.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, one of the reasons why a party like the Alternative, for example, can say that our values won't change is because there's choice, because it's a political party. So they're saying, this is what we stand for, you can choose us or not. If that wasn't the case, you'd probably need to, well, inevitably there would be much more conflict, because there could be much more diversity around the wants for the direction of that community. So some element of what you're describing of, in any case, discovering, moving outside, choosing, is going to be really important. And when I first approached this question today, it was very much from the point of, let's build something new and independent, and people choose their allegiance. So yeah, I think that's really important, and there's an element of humility in that.
Are you aware of any occurrences of similar designs of culture in the human history? Is there something, has this been tested before?
To deliberately build something?
To have a diverse set of values you can choose from. So in other words, you moved towards the values instead, changing the values where you are. Do you know of any occurrences in the
where people move toward the values they want to pick in the world? Isn't that what we all do every day? Like, the reason I moved to Berlin from Sweden is because I felt too restricted by the emphasis on consensus and conformity. So I moved to one of the most expressive cities I know, because that's me and what I wanted to explore and contribute to. Okay. Do you need something radically different?
So my observation is that most people don't do that. Most people stay where they are and might try and change the circumstances around them instead of moving where the circumstances match best who they want to be.
Right. But this also, we have tons of reasons to do that. I mean, it's costly. You're in a governmental system of literal belonging and citizenship, taxation, property. There are so many things that keep us where we are that doesn't. So when I think about some of these questions, I come at it from the point of human nature and human behavior. that doesn't mean that we're going to act in accordance with that. I do think that if we weren't so bound by lots of governance structures within our positioning, which we still are, even though we're moving towards a globalized world to a large extent, if that wasn't the case, I think people would move more. But you need a certain amount of, again, safety, freedom to be able to really act on those impulses. And look, like some of these things are questions that people never get the chance to ask in their entire lives. Like, what's my value? What do I believe? Or even grasping, I don't feel at home here. Why is that? Some people never have the opportunity for various reasons, lots of them socioeconomic, to even consider that. So like, yeah, I do think there is an inherent want to belong in that way, but you're very right that there are lots of conditions that don't make that an option.
So essentially you're saying if we ensure, or the basic needs for living are guaranteed somehow, and there is room for and process for personal development, people would choose the freedom to move where they meet the values that best match them.
Or maybe at least they would become conscious of their values, and this in turn might entail behaviors like moving closer to your values in those communities. I'm not saying actually that this is the case for everyone. I mean, you know, the Big Six personality test, for example, with the 6 traits of a human being, where one is how open you are to new experiences or not. That's also a personality trait. Even if we're all equally developed, conscious about values, I might have a very high degree of wanting new experiences. So I literally move, whereas someone else might not. But in any case, like, you need to get to the point of being value conscious to even entertain that thought. And we're not really getting there unless we have that guaranteed sense of safety that then enables our personal development.
But you could find expressions of all of these within an existing community, but not all of these might be beneficial. So, and that ties back into self-awareness and personal development. So if you know you have tendencies into one personality type direction, or however you want to encode this, then you can work with that either locally or by moving away. So you could even decide that although you're interested in the new and exploration, you want to stay and explore, trying to change the value set.
Totally.
Where you are.
Yeah.
So I think this is again a very interesting point where there's strong potential for conflict, and I'd be really curious to see how this can be resolved, or where there can be a safety valve for this type of conflict, where somebody is locked in between their desire to stay, which is probably very emotional binding to other people, and their desire to change their environment so it better fits them.
Yeah, it's hard. And if we're being honest, then probably we all encounter values conflicts many times, many days of our lives anyway, that we do find somehow a way to resolve. I mean, on a societal level, it's super interesting to observe. For example, there's one community in Papua New Guinea that in their core, they were very, they would say the paramount value is relationships. So the more relationships and the better relationships you have, the more ethical, the better your life is. But then they were overtaken by Christianity, which has a very strong influence on thinking about the individual and your individual sin and your individual responsibility. And so they had 2 paramount values, and they couldn't reconcile it. And how they kind of dealt with that was that the relational side of things still organized their everyday and their organizations, but they created rituals that enabled this heightened sense of living the Christian values, so that in themselves they felt that they were experiencing both worlds. But yeah, it's super complex, and you do need to create an experience of both.
This requires a high level of consciousness around these things if you want to deliberately design them. So somebody probably had the intuitive understanding that this is something that would help them, so they started ritualizing that and bringing other people along. One thing I found very helpful recently to deal with these ambiguities and make them visible is by encoding the potentiality of things in life in different forms of capital, which is an idea I borrow from Ethan Rowland, who wrote something about 8 forms of capital 10 years ago. It's a very interesting exercise to look at how wealthy an individual feels on these 8 forms of capital on the subjective level, because it's very hard to measure them. But it really clearly shows you where you in self-assessment might have a deficit, or where you might be strong. And using something like that, or you refer to the Big 6 personality test, that is something similar that is sometimes consciously used in organizations to ensure that you know what perspective your counterpart is coming from. Like I think so. There's the Herman brain dominance instrument developed at General Electric, and at Johnson & Johnson they use it, and it visually shows you in a spider graph how you're shaped, how your brain works, and they actually put it on their desk. So when you are speaking with somebody, they already know who they're confronted with, and tools like that might be helpful in having these conversations.
True. And we also need then to supplement that with the basic fundament, which I think is so important, that we are always developing. So one of the risks with putting something like that on your desk, I think the purpose it can really serve is as a language and a conversation starter. So, you know, if I do one of these tests and it says, I mean, maybe it calls me a driver, and I can be very assertive, which sometimes can read as scary. Let's just say that. And then once we're in a meeting and you're like, some of the assertiveness is coming out. I know you're a driver, but can we chill out? Then we have a mutual language and a way of resolving our differences, which is great. But if you start saying you're a driver and you do that for 10 years straight, and you never let me grow or grow out of that label, then I think we have a problem. So creating a language is really important. And again, the intention of mutual understanding and diversity, and less to do with rules and labels. So I wouldn't put something like that on my desk, but I would in a workshop. And yeah, I mean, I think it's also what you said about the different forms of capital and how many different things you can want and need in life at the same time is a really important point. And on a philosophical level, I just was reading Charles Taylor the other day talking about this, that on a very high level, we have 2 main schools of thought about what's good in life that makes it seem like we need to have this one thing that's on top. It's either going to be the Kantian justice, fairness, rule-based approach, where that comes first and everything else is second, or kind of a utilitarian, everyone's happiness and the good of the people at large comes first and everything else is below. And he argues that it just doesn't work this way in real life. Like, you can say that you have one value on top, but this never is how it goes, because then you don't take into consideration that within your hierarchy of values, there can be big choices of a certain kind and maybe smaller choices of a certain kind. So if you put justice on top, but then you have empathy, I don't know, there could be a very small thing to do with justice that competes with a very big thing to do with empathy, and maybe then empathy should come first. And he says the way to govern your life, and maybe even a society in that sense, is to think about the vision. So like, what life do you want? No one's going to say fairness as the response. It's like, what actual life do you want, and which choice is going to get you closer to that vision, even if every choice is not the right one. Because there's such strong emphasis on every choice being the right one, there being one pinnacle of values. But honestly, this is not how life goes, and I'm way too much of a pragmatist for that.
Are you aware of any culture or cultural practice that helps a group of people to continuously reevaluate that question? What life do we want to live? Is that, historically, do you know of anything?
Great question. Not really. Like, what I'm thinking of are these new and upcoming like values conscious communities and parties, like the alternative. But again, they say that our values are strictly in place. So it's kind of, you start off a project with a vision and reevaluate it less over time. Although I'm not sure, because those communities are still pretty new. I think they will become examples of that, because for sure we'll get to a point where any political party needs to assess their vision, either because they achieved it or because the society around them changed. So I would say I can't give you an example of someone who did that right now that I know of, but there are definitely organizations that are moving in this direction and working in this direction.
Well, I don't think it's necessary to change your set of values in order to reevaluate the way you want to live. So,
true.
So your underlying value sets might be very consistent and stable, just like there is a version of the commandments in almost any other big religion or small religion. And there is a version of the golden rule, the Kant's imperative in any culture that I've heard of. So I think this is very stable across humanity and across time. But that doesn't mean that the way you want to live as a community is stable.
You know what? I take it back in terms of not knowing any example, because the constant reevaluation of yourself as an active behavioring person, where your ethics is in your behavior, and that's why you reconsider all the time. That's ancient Greece.
Okay.
And especially Aristotelian philosophy and ethics. So saying that ethics, being a good person, means your behavior, and that can change at any point. And what you're striving to do is to live virtuously through your actions, which personally I'm a huge fan, because it means even if I was crap yesterday, I can be good tomorrow. Like, it's a redemptive project always. And that humans want to strive towards being good in this way, but it's very embodied, and it's very much in the choices that you make. And you can't live ethically in this way without always being conscious about your actions and where those are taking you in terms of developing certain virtues.
But in this sense, it's very individual.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a conversation on the level of the polis or even beyond, but it was a very individual choice to take any different action.
Yes and no, because I think okay, so first of all, I'm not a Greek scholar, so anyone who is, please correct me. But obviously we're paying attention to polis, but I think it's tempting now to think of personal development as something totally individual, but that's not how I understand Aristotle. For example, he had such a strong emphasis on friendship and those kinds of communities, smaller groups, where you together evaluate your thoughts and your behaviors, and you not only consider them for yourselves, but you push other people deliberately to become more virtuous. And he says that you should end a great friendship if that person does not seek a virtuous development. And it's your job as their friend to encourage and motivate and push them to be more virtuous in their lives. So in that way, it wasn't individual, although that was the focus, or maybe that's where the judgment lies. The way you arrive there is through mutual exploration, mutual pushing each other. And yeah, the polis is also a forum for uncovering this ethical behavior that was fundamentally thought of as being created mutually. So a smaller scale perhaps than what we're talking about in terms of being so deliberate about an entire culture, but at the same time, it's not enough to say that it was only individual.
I mean, the design of the polis was also set up towards deliberation and dialogue, much more than it is in our current situations.
Yeah, Socratic method and all of that.
Exactly. So, and also the concrete implementation of democracy, which was entirely different from today, where you were drawn by lots into a specific role, and you had to fill that role. That was your obligation, and you were part of a group that had to discuss what's around decisions. So there was no way out. It was an integral part of life as a member of that society. Of course, we have to take into account that member of that society meant that you were white male and were born there, but still the mechanics worked for that subgroup. There's no reason to assume why it wouldn't have worked if they had allowed everybody to have a voice in that. Actually, to the contrary, there's great evidence that it works very well. Mongolia, for example, gave themselves a new constitution in such a process, where 1,000 randomly chosen Mongolians were able to give themselves to deliberate for weeks and then give themselves a new constitution, which seemed to have worked pretty well.
Yeah, and in general, any kind of stakeholder involvement, or however you want to frame it, is just much more likely in a complex system to lead you to any kind of approximation of truth, because the moving parts, I mean, it's moving so quickly that if you really want to understand the needs of any community, the stakeholders from different groups within that community needs to be involved. And we never actually discussed the size of this independent community either. That could be an interesting context. But yeah, the deliberation method is really interesting. And it's also something that, speaking of upholding democracy and not taking institutions for granted, one way of doing that is really including people in those institutions and letting them feel the participatory element of it. So, for example, this Danish party, they did that as well. They had what they called laboratories around the country. And even in cities and places where people would never really engage with politics in that kind of way, and held mutual co-creative sessions deliberating on policy, not only to create that policy, but also to create the feeling of participation and engagement and democracy in politics, which then shapes the culture of Denmark, which is actually the project they're on. So yeah, it's really interesting.
But let's speak about size. I mean, you mentioned it. What in your experience or your feeling, knowledge, it would be a really good size for a community like that?
Well, there is that golden number of how many people we supposedly can keep in our head at the same time, which is 150. There's some evidence that above this it gets tricky, and then you need to start working with more of an imagined community. So one of the great things that enabled the nation state is the newspaper and the media and TV distribution, because just by seeing an interview with someone from the other end of Sweden, I realized, oh, there are Swedes in the other end of Sweden. I don't need to meet them, but I can imagine that we're all part of the same community. But the participatory element of actually knowing your community stops at about 150. So then that would also change how you create cohesion with which kinds of tools.
Okay. And is it 150 people? So there might be different versions of the Dunbar number. So
probably.
I think 150 that we can actually maintain a relationship with, but maybe another way to think about it could be that the size should be something around where you still recognize that somebody's new. So you don't have a relationship with everybody, because you can only have 150 of these, but you know who's part of the larger community. And my feeling for that would be around 500.
I'm not sure. I would think that really building relationships, I would think that they're more correspondent than we maybe give it credit for. However, one way you can separate knowing someone new is through symbolism. If everyone who's part of our community always wears a yellow sash, someone without a yellow sash, I'll be like, okay, good, they're not part of this community. Like, there are ways you can solve that, but I'm not so sure I would remember the face of 500 people. And maybe that's me, but yeah, I'm sure there's more research.
Okay. So essentially saying the number should be the number that you can still remember the people, keep them in your head, have a relationship with them.
Well, I guess it depends, like how deeply embedded this community is really going to be. For example, I'm in virtual communities that are huge, and that works totally fine. And also, especially because we might have subgroups that relate to specific things that we really support each other and help each other in a community way. But it doesn't really matter that I don't know everyone, because I mean, it's a virtual community. I don't live with them or whatever. But if it's going to be my everyday life, then in order to really create something from scratch that sticks to everyone, I mean, we already did that. We have nation states, so of course you can do it on a bigger scale. But if you want a closed off small community, yeah, I would probably try with a number that people can actually relate to each other to start.
And on the lower end, would you implement something like family or subgroups in some kind?
That one's also fascinating, because I read a paper on China and the kind of communist movement, and of thinking that actually in a communist system, it wouldn't be ideal if the only real unit was the nation, because then you're working towards the nation's goals, you have the planned economy, all of it. It would be nice if there weren't any subgroups. So they tried and failed massively, because it turns out that you can't get rid of the family. Like, humans want family. And especially for, I mean, we have procreative reasons, but also, as you said, like human closeness and love and all these things. Like, families are here to stay. So what they did instead was utilize the family as the ultimate system or the ultimate symbol of the nation instead. So now one of the most powerful communist symbols is the family, because you couldn't get rid of it. So you might as well use it to legitimize your system. So yeah, I would say that families, they're gonna appear. You can't help it. This is a human form of organization, as far as I understand it.
Yeah, the kibbutzim movement, they try to play with that and remove that element. It somehow didn't work.
It doesn't work. Humans want family. So that's probably gonna be there. But again, you can have all of these community interactive elements that don't need to be in competition with a family necessarily.
Okay. So there's a lot of stuff that is definitely worth unpacking still further. I have this sense, a feeling of how it could be done. But no concrete recipe so far. I would have to,
Yeah. You know why? It's because because unless the theory of human nature, the theory of change, the values and the goals are completely set, there is no recipe. As I said, there are elements, but I would never try to say, this is exactly the kind of ritual you should have, or this is exactly the kind of system you should build, unless I'm fully aware of your goals.
So form follows function.
So for me, it's deliberate, because I feel that there are many cases where we put in processes and institutions without really considering what we're trying to achieve. So that's again why it's kind of on the abstract.
But this is I think it shines through in several spots in this conversation. I think this is your most important element here, right? That you have a conscious, deliberate conversation and decision about how do you want to live, and then everything else has to follow that.
Yeah.
And that this is also transparent, so that others can make a also conscious choice about whether they want to be part of this, and thirdly, that the underlying values are stable, so that you can trust that even though that horizon towards the best version of life might change over the course of time, the underlying value set will not, or not drastically at least.
Yeah, exactly, because they are based on your fundamental understanding of the world you want to see, the life you want to live, and how you think that you as a human fit within that.
Okay. And that as a meta design strategy, so what I just described, and then within that to enforce that and to enable the continuous conversation around how do we want to live, to perpetuate the values. You need a set of rituals and symbols that help you do that.
Yeah, for sure. And also being flexible in using different kinds of cultural elements to resolve the things that inevitably come up. As you said, I mean, there's conflict around every corner. And the most important thing then is having those values and that understanding of where we're going, and hopefully then the values including actually accepting friction and diversity and figuring out those processes based on the needs of that community at that moment in time. I mean, it's very tempting to say, and you will need, of course, a lot of scenarios that you've thought through, but at the end of the day, humans are super complex, and it's actually better to have a value system you can rely on to design new things and have a process for design rather than a process for every single scenario, because life's too complex.
Wow, I feel complete.
Yeah.
There's I learned a lot, and I think the distillation of that is very valuable. I think there's this some very short but sweet outcome that can be used if somebody wants to go out and build a culture inside of such a community.
Good.
Wow, thank you.
I hope for. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's use it as a first building block, because whenever you want to continue that conversation, I'm pretty sure that there are things that will grow out of this conversation in your mind, if you want to continue that conversation, to build on it, I'm always, or we are always ready.
And also, as a final note for me, again, I think community is so important.
Yeah.
So, you know, I can easily change my mind if I come up with new information that turns out that we need to design it differently or whatever. And that's so important. So treating it as a conversation rather than a recipe or a design over rules, that's so important to me. So yeah, let's keep it going.
Cool.
Cool.
Thank you.